I am the President and CEO of Genetic Alliance, and we welcome all of you to this webinar. This webinar is part of our series, part of Genetic Alliance's Bootcamp for Registries, and part of a series of webinars we're doing on registries. This is actually the foundational webinar. I'm really pleased to introduce Michelle Levy of OM1. Michelle has been involved in, I think, registry since she was about 2 years old, because her history, at least as far as I remember, is quite a long time. And I've relied on her work myself over many, many years, having devised my first registry in 1995. We have used what Michelle will describe as a basis for our bootcamp. And so advocacy organizations using Genetic Alliance's bootcamp get training in all of the things that Michelle will describe. And those who join our promise for engaging everyone responsibly, our registry platform, actually get a lot of technical assistance around many of these elements. Everything you see here in the next hour will be recorded, is being recorded, and it will be available in our webinar archive on Genetic Alliance's website, and the slides will be available there too. If you have any questions, we're going to keep everybody muted because we'll have nearly 100 individuals, I think. Happy to see them pop up in the chat. I'll track them, and we will ask Michelle to answer as many as is possible during this hour. And if not, maybe we can consolidate them and get them to Michelle after the webinar as well. And so without further ado, Michelle, take it away. And thank you so much for doing this.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm excited to be here today to talk about planning registries. I have worked with patient registries for a number of years, both from a practical standpoint and then also as one of the editors of the AHRQ guide on registries for evaluating patient outcomes. So I'm excited to share some of what I've learned and to talk a little bit about the importance of good planning. So just to note before we, make sure I can, there we go. Just to note before I start, a lot of what I'll talk about today is coming from the work that AHRQ has funded over the past, it's been more than a decade now, trying to improve the quality and reliability of patient registries. So just wanted to acknowledge their role in all of this. So before we dive into some of the considerations around planning, I want to take a minute and just talk a little bit about how we think about patient registries and where they've come in the past several years. As I mentioned, a lot of this is coming from the Registries for Evaluating Patient Outcomes series of users guides. We developed the first one back in 2007 and then have updated it over the past several years. So we've really been able to track the progress and evolution of patient registries over the past decade or so. And there's been quite a bit of change. It's really been exciting to see these evolve. And I will note that our 4th edition is coming this summer. I don't have a publication date yet, but I'm thinking it will be sometime toward the end of July or early August. So more to come. So just as a starting point, what do we mean by a patient registry? We've defined patient registries as organized systems that use observational study methods to collect uniform data to evaluate specified outcomes for a population that is defined by a disease, condition, or exposure. This definition is one that we've used since the beginning, and it really, it is a broad definition. It covers the wide range of registries that are out there, but some of the key points are that we're collecting uniform data, so consistent data across patients. We're evaluating outcomes that we've specified, and we're looking at particular populations. And you'll see those themes come back into play when we talk about some of the steps of planning. As I mentioned, we see patient registries used for really a wide variety of purposes, ranging from observing the natural history of diseases to looking at particular treatments, to looking at treatment patterns in particular patient populations. Some registries are designed specifically to look at maybe comparative questions around comparative effectiveness, for example. We also see registries designed for safety surveillance and for quality improvement. And some registries really hit multiple purposes. So there's a really tremendous variety in the way registries are used. And as I mentioned, over the course of our work with the Registries Guide, we've really seen the use of registries evolve and expand. Part of this has to do with the widespread adoption of electronic health records, some of the ability to leverage existing data sources and combine those data for new purposes. There are a lot of factors here, but we have seen that registries are moving toward providing decision support at the point of care in some cases. We've seen some registries supporting value-based care efforts or questions around coverage and reimbursement. There's more interest in registries as a source of real-world data and real-world evidence for regulatory decisions. And in some cases, registries form a platform for other types of studies, maybe pragmatic clinical trials or nested studies. So with all of these different purposes, we've really come to think of registries as, in some ways, a foundation for a learning healthcare system. Registries can meet a lot of the different purposes that we want to try to address within a learning healthcare system, from the research side to the clinical practice side, through quality measurement and quality improvement, to tracking patient outcomes over the long term. So really a broad role for patient registries. And then just to highlight the 4th edition, this is, as I mentioned, coming soon. So we're very excited about that. And it is a little bit different than some of the other editions. We had thought maybe it was a little long, with the prior edition having 25 chapters. So we've tried to streamline it down and really focus on, some of the core concepts. And I think particularly to make sure that we're adequately thinking about all of the potential sources for data, whether we're collecting information directly from patients, whether we're incorporating data from EHRs or pulling in data from other sources. We've tried to factor those considerations into each of the chapters in the user's guide. So we're going to focus today primarily on the content that is in chapter 2, planning a registry. So let's dive in. First, I just want to start by acknowledging the importance of registry planning. It maybe seems obvious, but when we think about registries, there are so many possibilities in terms of the size of the registry, the number of investigators that might participate, the number of participants in the registry. Registries look at all different types of conditions. They may follow patients for a very long time in some cases, or they may look at a very specific period, maybe a very acute moment, and then that's it. So there can be all sorts of different designs that are appropriate for a particular registry. And there can really be, a great deal of variation in the amount of data that we're dealing with and in the geographic scope of the registry. So this flexibility is great because it allows registries to meet all of those different purposes that I was talking about a minute ago, but it also means that we have to think carefully about all of these different choices so that registries can be designed and be successful. So we'll talk a little bit about all of the steps that are essential in planning a registry today. When we think about steps in planning a registry, we generally break it down into these 9 steps that I'm showing here. We start off by clearly stating the purpose of the registry. And then once you know what you want to do with the registry, it's important to take a step back and really assess, is the registry the right choice? Are the data that you capture in the registry going to be useful for your intended purpose? And has this already been done? Then once you decide to move forward, steps involve identifying stakeholders, assessing feasibility and sustainability, building out the registry team, thinking through what your governance and oversight will look like, defining what you're going to be collecting in terms of the scope of the registry and any additional validation that might be necessary. Then getting into the details. What are the data? Who are the participants in the registry going to be? And then lastly, designing your study plan or your protocol and your project plan. So we'll go through each of these and talk about what is necessary at each step along the way. So let's start off by thinking about the registry purpose. When we're defining the registry purpose, we want to be clear about what the registry is intended to accomplish. And I think we want to be very specific as well. The purpose is going to drive many of the decisions as we move through the planning process. It's going to inform the design of the study, whether we have a single cohort or maybe whether we need comparators. It's going to define the types of data that we collect, the scope in terms of how many participants we need, whether we need to collect data in multiple countries or within one country. The purpose is going to influence all of those decisions. So it's important to be clear upfront about what do we intend to accomplish with this registry. And then once we have a clear purpose, we can translate that into specific objectives. What are the questions that this registry is going to try to answer? And those objectives will then help us get to the level of what are the data elements that we need, how long do we need to follow participants, and so on. So I want to show an example of a very specific registry purpose. This is a purpose from a registry designed to look at treatment for atrial fibrillation. It was a fairly large registry within the US that looked specifically at particular types of anticoagulation treatments. But you can see in this description of the registry that it's going to evaluate, describe, and document. It's looking at safety of particular types of treatments. It's looking at patients with AF, with atrial fibrillation. We're interested in the clinical outcomes, the treatment patterns, the clinical course, and we're interested in the characteristics of these patients. So this purpose statement, very detailed, but it gives you a clear roadmap of what that registry is going to need to think about as they are thinking through what the study design will look like, what the patient population will be, and what sorts of data they're going to need to collect. You can imagine how these would map to patients with AF, patients who have new onset, first detected AF, how that would get you to those next steps in the planning process. So not all registry purpose statements are quite this detailed, but I just wanted to give an example of how defining your purpose can then help you get through the next steps of the planning process. So once we have a clear purpose for a registry, it's time to take that step back and think about, is a registry really the right way to go? As we had mentioned, there are lots of good uses for registries. They can fulfill a lot of different purposes, but they're not always the most appropriate option. In some cases, it may not be necessary to do a new study at all. There may be a study that's already looking at a similar question that could be adapted to answer a new question. There could be other sources of data that are already out there that maybe could be pulled out and used in, for example, a retrospective study to answer a particular question. There are also, in some cases, questions that need to be answered through other study designs. If we're really trying to understand the efficacy of a treatment, for example, we would want to consider things like randomized controlled trials. There are also cases where we just need to have a trial in order to understand exactly what's happening in different types of patient populations. So in some cases, registries are going to be the most appropriate choice, but there does need to be consideration of whether it is the right choice for a particular question. Some factors to consider when thinking about choosing a registry are how the data are going to be used, what types of decisions you want to be able to make based on these data, who will be using the data, and then also thinking about, these somewhat get to the feasibility question, but thinking about how long do you need to collect the data, how long do you need to collect the data, when do you ideally want to have an answer to your question, and how difficult will it be to access the data of interest and the population of interest. So important questions, they're going to be a little bit different for each question that a registry is trying to address. Once a group or a research team feels confident that a registry is the way to go, then we dive into the steps of actually building out what that registry is going to look like. And an important step early on is to identify key stakeholders. Stakeholders could be anyone really who's going to be interested in the answers to the research questions. So these could be, for example, clinicians who are treating patients. These could be patients themselves. These could be other groups that might be making decisions about treatments, about guidelines, and so on. So lots of potential audiences here. In thinking about the stakeholders, we usually break these down into the primary stakeholders, so those who are actually going to be setting up and funding the registry, and then secondary stakeholders, so everyone else who's going to potentially benefit from the registry knowledge. And I should actually just say, as we're going through, I'm talking about these steps as though they all occur in sequence, but some of these may occur in parallel. You could certainly be talking to key stakeholders while you're assessing whether a registry is the right option. So just keep in mind that these don't have to be done strictly in sequence. So in thinking about our stakeholders, here are some additional examples of potential stakeholders. I mentioned a few of these. Other groups might be professional societies that are interested in the topic. Depending on the topic, we would see interest potentially from regulatory authorities or public health agencies. Also, product manufacturers are sometimes interested in these questions as well. So all potential stakeholders. And then there's the question of how. So starting off by identifying who might be interested is a good first step. But then there's the question of how do you engage with these stakeholders? What works in practice? Certainly informal conversations are helpful early on to understand what groups might be interested, to start to build those connections. But as the registry planning starts to move forward, ideally there would be defined interactions with the stakeholders so that it's clear what is being discussed, what sort of decisions are being made, and so there's clear documentation of each of those different steps. We often think about advisory committees that have a clear role, maybe a planning committee that's helping to think through some of these questions and provide structured feedback to the team that's developing the registry. I will note that we do have a new chapter in the 4th edition of the Registries Guide specifically on governance and oversight, and it does touch on these questions around how to engage with stakeholders in a little bit more detail. I also wanted to point to another resource. There is an addendum to the 3rd edition of the User's Guide called 21st Century Patient Registries that specifically talks about engaging with patient stakeholders. So this provides, I think, some really useful information about how to work with different types of patient advocacy organizations, patient representatives, and other groups that might be interested in working with registry developers. And there also is some really useful information from HACORI here, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, around engaging with different types of stakeholder groups. So an important step, and one that ideally is going to continue throughout the planning process, and in some cases throughout the life of the registry. A next question, as we continue to think through the steps of planning, is around assessing the feasibility of the registry. This really has two components. Funding is obviously a big component of this. Registries do obviously require funding, and depending on what types of questions you're trying to answer, the funding need could be fairly substantial. There are many possible sources of funding. There are some examples here of potential sources. We've also seen some registries that operate with multiple sponsors through a public-private partnership format. And that can also be a useful way to fund a registry. So I certainly don't want to downplay the importance of funding. Feasibility also incorporates questions around, will you be able to capture the necessary data? Are they generally captured in routine clinical care? Is this a question that can be answered given the way given the availability of patients and the data that you might want. So we'll see those questions come up as we go through some of the discussions later on. But feasibility is an important step, particularly around funding and particularly around the sustainability piece as well. You know, we often think about what's necessary for the initial funding of the registry, but many registries are intended to be long-term studies. And so making sure that there's a plan for identifying new funding opportunities in the future if necessary, and really just, you know, having a plan to continue to have funding for the registry throughout the duration of that data collection period is an important piece. The registry team is also important to consider early on. These are some of the types of expertise that are important when building out a registry team. You know, as you can see from what we've talked about so far, there are lots of considerations when developing a registry. So it's important to be able to access people with different areas of expertise so that you can consider all of these you know, possible areas fully. Project management is critical. There are a lot of moving pieces with most registries, particularly during the planning phase, but also during the operations phase. And having someone with experience in project management can be extremely helpful to keep everyone else on track and to make sure that the project is proceeding according to a timeline and the project plan, and importantly, according to the budget. The subject matter expertise is also, you know, obviously critical. I think there are two pieces here, really making sure that we understand the clinical questions that we're trying to answer and that we're collecting the appropriate data to answer those questions. And then this is another area where it can be really helpful to have representatives from the participants, the intended participants of the registry. The participants in these cases can provide feedback on what is important to capture, what is important to them in designing the registry, and also what is reasonable to ask in terms of, you know, for example, completing patient-reported outcome instruments. How often would participants be willing to do that? How much time is too much? You know, those sorts of questions can be really important for the success of the registry, and you know, really the participants in the registry would be the best group to be able to answer those. Also important to think about the science of how the data will be collected and analyzed. That's where epidemiology and biostatistics can come into play. Particularly important there for helping to guide some of the decisions around what data are necessary and how the study design will then enable us to answer those questions of interest. And then obviously the biostatistics piece is extremely helpful as we get into the analysis phase of the project. Experience around setting up the database for the registry also is important to have throughout the duration of the project. And then I just want to emphasize the legal and ethical issues. It is important to have someone available to a registry team who can answer those questions and help make sure that the registry is operating as it should in terms of protecting patient privacy and complying with all of the necessary requirements there. And I will note that that certainly gets more complicated as a registry moves from a national data collection effort to an international data collection effort. And related to that last point, related to the thinking about the ethical framework for the registry, we also want to think early on about what governance and oversight would be appropriate for a registry. This is an area where I think there's been more attention in recent years to developing transparent governance structures. These can vary widely depending on the registry, and really it's depending on the registry. Very different types of governance might be appropriate. Overall, when we're thinking about governance, we're thinking about a group that's going to help drive the execution of the registry, that's going to help determine early on the purpose, help oversee the funding, and then as the registry starts to accumulate data, it's going to help guide the dissemination of information from the registry. We're thinking again about transparency here, about making sure that it's clear to all of the participants in the registry how the registry is being run, how the decisions are being made, when and why information is reported out from the registry. So I'm going to show some examples of different types of governance committees, but I just want to emphasize that these are examples. Most registries would not have all of these, but they might have, some form of governance structure depending on the size and the scope of the registry. So often what we see in registries is there'll be a group that is responsible for setting up the registry or for leading the registry. And then there'll be an oversight or an operations group that's helping to run the registry sort of on a day-to-day basis. That's pretty typical. The advisory committees are more dependent on the purpose of the registries. Some registries will, for example, have to have an adjudication committee because of the particular question that they're trying to answer, but that's fairly uncommon. What we do see more often are some type of committee that is thinking about the scientific questions, basically considering on an ongoing basis whether the registry is meeting its purpose, whether anything needs to change, whether really the registry is going to be able to meet those objectives that it laid out in the beginning. And then we also frequently see some effort around data access and publications. This may come in to play more as a registry has accumulated data, but there may be requests from participants in the registry to use the data for some type of analysis. There may be requests from external parties to access the registry data to try to answer new questions. And so thinking up front about how will the registry handle those requests is very important. In some cases, we see an idea that maybe we can think about the data access and publications piece later, but it really is important to bring it up in the planning phase because the thoughts around how you might want to share the data with external parties can influence what sort of language goes into agreements with participating investigators, as well as possibly into the informed consent for participants in the registry. So it is important to have an idea up front how you might want to be able to use the data once there are sufficient data in the registry to do analyses and potential linkages with other sources and so on. So definitely not to say that every registry needs all of this. That's certainly not the case, but these are the types of things that we want to think about when we're thinking about governance. What is necessary for this registry and what should we plan now so that we're in a good position later on when we need to maybe make a change to the registry or when we want to use the data in a particular way. So once we've thought about those, all of those questions, getting us through the feasibility, the governance, then we really get into what I consider to be, the nuts and bolts of the registry. What are we going to be collecting for the data set? And this is when, we really get in, we get into the weeds. And in my experience, this is where we spend all of the time. These are really the tough questions. When we usually start off here by thinking about the scope of the data that we're going to need to answer the questions that we've identified. And I've flagged here that, again, this all comes back to the purpose and the objectives that we outline up front in the registry. Some of the key things that we think about for the scope of the data are the size of the registry, which can be thought of as the number of data elements that we're collecting and the complexity of those data elements. It can be thought of as how often we're collecting data, and in terms of how many investigators are participating in the registry and how many participants we have within the registry. We also think about the setting. Are we collecting data from a single academic medical center, or are we collecting data from 500 individual practices, or are we collecting data in multiple settings? More and more we see that we are collecting data in multiple settings. So for example, we're collecting data from maybe a physician who's participating, but then we're also collecting data directly from a participant in the form of patient-reported outcomes. So there can be quite a bit of variety here in terms of the setting for a registry. We think about the duration. Are we going to collect data for 1 year, for 5 years, for 15 years? And what does that mean for the scope of the registry? I mentioned earlier geography. Some registries are all the way down to a single center, whereas others may be international in scope. That obviously has a huge impact on the planning phase of the registry. We think about the cost of the registry, and all of these factors influence the cost. And then lastly, it is important to also think about the richness of the data. And this goes back, I think, to the complexity of the data points that I mentioned a moment ago. Some data points are more straightforward than others. So for example, a registry that is collecting death as an outcome, it's a fairly straightforward, not always easy to get, but a fairly straightforward data point. Whereas in some cases, we may be interested in diagnosis of a rare condition where diagnosis itself is complicated and could require multiple data points just to get to the diagnosis. So there's a lot of variability in the richness of the data that we need for a registry, and that's going to factor into the scope. And I also should have mentioned, in thinking about the data, another piece that comes into play there is whether we need, for example, biosamples, whether we need images. Some of those other types of data are also going to have an impact on the scope and the setup of the registry. So thinking through these questions gets us through the first step of defining what we're going to collect for the data. And then related to that is this question of the scientific rigor. So we have the data that we're going to need to collect. What else do we need to do to make sure that we're confident in those data? Does there need to be any sort of validation? I mentioned earlier, in some cases, there can be adjudication of particular outcomes. Are those things going to be necessary to meet the purpose of the registry? This is really where an example of where the purpose of the registry is going to drive the decisions that are being made here. So for example, if it is a study that's being done primarily to look at questions related to safety, and it's going to be used for submission to a regulatory authority, there's going to be a higher level of rigor that's needed than for a study that's maybe describing treatment patterns in a particular patient population. So definitely important to think about the purpose and also to consult with those stakeholders that we talked about early on, because they can also help inform the decisions that are made here. So once we have a sense of the scope of our data collection, then we get into the points of actually defining what are we going to collect. And obviously the data elements that are going to be collected in a particular registry are going to vary depending on the area of focus and the purpose and so on. But when we think about the core data set, we usually focus in on two concepts: need to know and nice to know. And I think we talk about that a lot. Need to know data are really the core data, the data that you have to answer your questions. Anything else is nice to know. So when we're thinking about the registry, we want to make sure that we're not collecting so much data that it becomes infeasible for practices to participate, so that it becomes just overwhelming in terms of the burden and the cost. We want to narrow in on what are the essential things that we need to answer the questions that we've identified. And then maybe we can add a few supplemental things, a few nice to know items, maybe to answer an exploratory question, or because we know that this may be important in the future, but generally we try to limit the nice to know and focus on the need to know. It's also important when we're defining our data set to think about whether it's going to be feasible to collect that data. Registries are, by definition, observational in nature, meaning that they are observing what's happening in routine clinical care for a participant. So we want to make sure that anything that we are collecting is going to be done as part of routine clinical care. We do not want to be, requesting particular tests or other pieces of data that would not be normally documented, both because that introduces burden, but also because from an ethical standpoint, that could tip this into an interventional study, which has different requirements. So important to think about as we're defining our need to know data set. And also, I'll just note that the feasibility question can become more complicated when we're talking about registries that are international in scope, because then you do see variation in what is considered routine in different countries. So something to consider. In addition to defining our data set, we also define our patient outcomes. Outcomes are going to be the endpoints of the study. What are we trying to measure? Typically, we break these down into our primary outcome of interest and then our secondary outcomes of interest. And we do want to make sure that these are defined clearly. So defining exactly what we mean by the outcome. As an example, in asthma, studies will often look at exacerbations, but an exacerbation can mean something different to different clinicians and also to different patients. So we need to have a clear definition of what do we consider to be an exacerbation for this study. And in general, we always encourage using standardized definitions or consensus-based definitions whenever possible. That enables the data from one registry to be more easily compared to other studies that are out there. So we get a broader sense of what is happening in that clinical area. And then related to the point of defining outcomes, we also think about our PROs, or patient-reported outcomes. This is something that's become increasingly important in the past several years. I think there's really been a shift within clinical research to recognize the importance of hearing directly from the patients and including that perspective within registries as well as in other sorts of studies. We've seen this from PCORI, we've seen interest here from the FDA and from other groups as well. So definitely important to think about whether PROs are something that should be part of this study, whether they're going to be relevant to the study purpose, whether they're going to help address the questions of interest. And then also it's important, as I mentioned earlier, to consider the burden. Are these going to be, what are patients willing to take the time to complete, and how often should that be done? And then again, we encourage the use of validated instruments whenever possible. So then moving on there, once we've thought about the data we need to collect, we want to think about our target population. This is the population to which the findings of the registry are meant to apply. So of course, we're only going to enroll, going back to the atrial fibrillation example, we're only going to enroll a subset of patients with atrial fibrillation, but we're trying to enroll a representative subset so that the results will be relevant to patients with AF generally. So we want to think about how common is it, how easily can we identify potential participants, and then I think this point about our other sources competing for the same patients is an important one to highlight here, because in the cases of conditions that are maybe less common, we do want to make sure that patients are not already enrolled in a different study, for example. Once we've thought through our data elements and our outcomes and our target population, we get to the point where we can roll all of this information up into our study plan or our study protocol. Generally, developing a full protocol is preferred. It will require all of these questions we've been talking about to be thought through in advance. So for example, the protocol is going to document the objectives, the design, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, so really specifying your target population. It's going to define your outcomes. It's going to define clearly how data are going to be collected and what data will be collected. It will touch on the governance piece that we thought about, and it will also touch on how patient privacy is going to be protected here within the registry. So the full study protocol is preferable, but at minimum, any registry should have at least a study plan that documents the objectives of the study, who is eligible to be enrolled, and how the data are going to be collected. And there are, I think, some good templates out there to help get to a study protocol. And then lastly, there's the project plan. This is where the project manager I mentioned earlier can really, really help move things along. The project plan is just rolling up all of these steps that need to happen to take the registry from an idea to an actual operating registry. So there's usually an overall plan, there's a timeline with specific steps to get us to the launch of the registry. There definitely needs to be a plan for managing the costs for the budget. Usually there's plans in place for the quality piece, making sure that whatever we're setting up in terms of data collection procedures and systems are going to be of sufficient quality for the registry purpose. We need to think about who is going to staff the registry. How are we going to manage recruitment, enrollment of participants, all of the different steps along the operations. Typically, there's a plan around communications. How are we going to share information about the registry, both at the start and then, as we move through the data collection phases. And then lastly, there's sometimes, and I think this is important, a risk management plan. The risk management plan would typically think through what are the potential risks that would, possibly limit the ability of the registry to meet its objectives. So, for example, the ability to enroll enough participants, the ability to recruit enough investigators to participate, the availability of the data. There are lots of potential risks along the way. Thinking about them up front and documenting them in a structured way can be really helpful, both to identify things you can address early on, and then also to come up with those mitigation plans later on. Like, what will you do if a lot of patients decide not to enroll in the registry? How will you try to address that problem? So an important step that I think sometimes gets overlooked. And then lastly, I just want to emphasize that we can do the best possible job planning our registry, but we should all know that it will probably change. There may be instances where the registry is not meeting its objectives for low enrollment or other types of issues. There can also be just changes in the treatment landscape or in introduction of new treatments. There can be changes in the funding situation. So all sorts of things can drive change within a registry. I would say most registries have to go through a change process at some point. So just be ready for it. Typically, change management is going to follow the steps that we outlined in the planning process. It's a little easier because you already have the registry, but it is important to go through those steps and think through the changes carefully, and to document the changes carefully so that you don't undo all of that that good work that you've already done with planning. Oh, and I will mention, I just wanted to highlight a few things related to rare disease registries. And I think we've talked about most of these, but just to mention, within this type of registry, we see that the role of stakeholders is particularly important in terms of their interest in the registry, their investment in the registry, and also the idea of providing information to multiple stakeholders. So that engagement tends to be very important both early on and throughout the life of the registry. We also see more potential for the registries to change over time, as, for example, new treatments become available. And then, of course, the limited number of patients should be considered in the planning phase. I'm going to talk just briefly, before we move into questions, I wanted to just take a moment to connect what we've talked about in terms of planning to those earlier points about how registries are used. And this is another area where we've seen a lot of change in recent years. Really starting before this, but the 21st Century Cures Act, I think, really highlighted the potential of registries for providing real-world evidence. So information other than from a clinical trial that could be used to inform decision-making. And you can see this is the FDA definition of real-world evidence and also of real-world data. And they specifically highlight here product and disease registries as a potential source of real-world data that could then be used to generate real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. So this, I think, highlighted the potential role of registries here. And in some ways, registries were already being used in this capacity, so it wasn't exactly new, but I think it certainly this official recognition of the role of registries increased the interest in using registries for these types of purposes. And when we think about using registries here, it really comes down to, are the data going to be suitable for this purpose? The FDA determines the suitability of real-world data based on the relevance and reliability. Those are their key terms that they call out. And when we think about relevance and reliability, we're really thinking about many of the factors related to data quality that we've just been thinking about. Is the registry relevant for the purpose that you're trying to answer, and can you rely on those data elements? And we see that those themes around relevance and reliability in many other publications about real-world data quality, about the use of real-world evidence. These are just a few, but there are quite a few out there, and those themes filter through. And when we think about the concepts we've talked about today in planning, the steps we take in planning are what are going to determine whether the data are going to be relevant and reliable for a particular purpose. These are the tables from the end of the Registries Guide where we think about assessing quality. And as you look through these tables, they really read in some ways like a checklist of the points that we've talked about today. These are just a few of the examples, but the essential elements of good practice for registries really come back to what decisions were made during the planning phase, how carefully was planning done, and did you follow through on all of the things that you intended to do in the planning phase? So just a moment to reiterate that the planning piece really is critical for all of the other steps of, for making sure that the registry is going to operate smoothly, for making sure that you're going to be able to use the data for analyses, and then for making sure that the evidence that you generate in the registry are going to be useful for the purposes that you intended to use them for. I do want to just note there are a lot of resources out there to help. Sharon mentioned some earlier on. There's the AHRQ registry guides, some other references as well that can be helpful. But let me stop there because I want to make sure we have some time for questions.
Great, thanks, Michelle, very much for such a great overview, very clear. As we all know, this is very complicated. So there are a number of questions, and I'll read them to you, and we'll see how many we can get to. First one, do PROs refer only to tools, questionnaires that patients complete, or do they include patient-entered data about their clinical symptoms and care?
Oh, yeah, that's a good distinction. So we often think of PROs, I think we generally think of PROs as specifically patient-reported outcomes, usually captured in the form of a validated instrument. So thinking of, as an example, in depression, we often collect the PHQ-9, which measures patients' symptoms of depression and then generates a score that represents their severity of depression symptoms. But patient-generated data, which could be outcomes or other types of data, symptoms, any other information, I think is equally important. And we want to think about how that fits into the registry. So thinking back to those the core data set. Patient-generated data could be part of the core data set. You know, symptoms or medical history, those types of things. It could also, in the form of patient-reported outcomes, be part of an outcome measure of interest as well.
Great, thanks. And that leads somewhat into the next question for patient-driven registries, for us to do validation of PROs so that it's acceptable to a regulatory body. We've had in the past 2 weeks, Chris Forrest give us an overview of PROMISE, and we've had Carol Hamilton do an overview of Phoenix and all the measures there. So we've heard validated, 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 and there's lots of questions about exactly what constitutes validation and can we do that?
Yeah, so I mean, typically when we think about, and I can follow up with some publications here that might be helpful, but we're typically thinking, when we think about validation, we're thinking about, you know, does the instrument capture what we think it captures? You know, so do patients interpret the questions the same way so that we're getting the same type of answers so that we can sort of compare across patients? So, you know, do the questions mean the same thing to different patients? Is it like consistent over time? You know, if I did it today and then I do it again in a week, like, do I still think about those questions the same way? There are a couple of different concepts around, you know, the reliability, the ability to measure change meaningfully, that go into whether or not it's validated. There's a whole body of literature here. Let me follow up with some specific publications, if that would help.
That would be great. And if you have a recommendation for who we might want to give a webinar on it, or if you want to, yes. We'd be happy to. We're trying to cover all of the bases for the various aspects. Okay, next, go ahead.
Well, I'll just add that, you know, registries in some cases can be a good way to, like, take a PRO and gather enough data to validate it. So that's another area. Okay, I'll follow up.
Yeah. Good point, because one of the points I really wanted to emphasize is your point that this is not a linear, sequential kind of activity we're looking at here. There's a lot of overlap and so on. Okay, what would you say about who owns the data?
Oh, that's a really hard question. And I mean, I think it's changing, you know, it depends on, different sponsors have different ideas. There are a lot of, I think there's a real move towards, you know, making the data more available, like sharing data within NIH. And then the whole consideration of, you know, patients, the participants in the registry really owning their own data. So,
we will have a webinar on this if you want to get off the hook.
Yes, I'll say it depends on a lot of factors.
Okay. How about longevity of data? So what happens when the funding runs out? We've all seen this, either an academic or, you know, even a company decides to orphan the process. What about what to do then?
Yeah, it's another good point, and something that it is good to think about in the planning phase. You know, sometimes we see those data sets put into, you know, different types of repositories where they can be accessed under, you know, very specific terms for future use. Sometimes it's really hard to do that because the terms under which the data were originally collected, you know, the informed consents with the patients, the agreements with the investigators, make it, you know, next to impossible for the data to be used for any other purpose. So I think we are seeing, you know, more thought early on about structuring the agreements and structuring the consents so that the data could be used to answer other questions in the future. And then that opens the door to putting those data sets into, you know, different types of repositories so that they can be shared. But I'd say it's really, there's not really anything consistent at the moment.
Great, thank you. How would a person define a patient population if the population is at a subclinical threshold? So looking at the etiology of the disease and people who don't meet clinical definitions of that disease yet.
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, I think Yeah, you could certainly, try to identify a couple of, eligibility criteria that would then, potentially lead to a diagnosis later on. But you're going to end up, from an analysis standpoint, having to try to break that population out into, patients who eventually did get a diagnosis and patients who did not. Yeah, we have seen that sometimes in, I've seen that in lupus as an example.
Yeah, and I think the other place we are concerned about it is the diagnostic odyssey, and a couple companies have approached Genetic Alliance to use peer to look at, for example, now that we can capture EHR in peer to see, can we start to map that, one disease or another, knew that these were the various features that led up to that disease actually being diagnosed.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is, I think, a case where you'd want to have pretty broad objectives, because you're trying to understand what's happening there, and you leave some flexibility to add research questions in the future, as hopefully you get a better sense of how a diagnosis might be made.
Yeah. Any suggestions, and this is from an advocacy organization leader, any suggestions from about having a dialogue with the clinical community that has a registry that captures one type of data and perceives any other group, including us patient organizations, as a competitor for funding and data capture? We want to be complementary versus competitive to see what's missing and to capture that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I would hope, I hope the field has shifted, to recognize the value of the perspective that the patient groups are bringing. I think coming at it from the perspective of, what could be added, what else could be, could be missing that would be valuable. But yeah, that's a really tough one if they're resistant to it.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of examples of, where,
yes.
And maybe just coming at it from the examples.
Yeah, and Susan, what we could do is give you some of those examples, because we worked through with some disease groups how exactly to do that. In fact, I'm actively involved in one that we have a meeting for tomorrow. And usually once the clinicians get comfortable with the participation of the advocacy groups, there's a little more flexibility there.
Yeah.
And then last question so far anyway, how does the registry monitor or avoid selection bias given the voluntary nature of participation?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it depends, but I mean, it does depend a bit on the patient population of interest. I think you can never entirely avoid it, right? I mean, you can try to avoid selection bias by, setting up your enrollment procedures so that you're not, for example, only enrolling, I'm trying to think of a good example, but like only enrolling patients who are seen on, at particular times or particular days, or, there are other sorts of, you can try to be as broad as possible in your enrollment procedure so that you're not, inadvertently leaving people out. But beyond that, you can't really control which patients will agree to participate and which patients won't. And it's possible that there may be differences. You may find that patients who are, sicker, for example, just don't feel up to it and so decide not to participate. Or, there are lots of different, potential scenarios there. So, what we usually say is that you try to think about where there might be selection bias, you try to avoid it, and then the next best thing is to, if possible, have some sort of screening log where you document just basic information about the types of patients that decline to participate. Nothing that would be, identifiable since they're not agreeing to participate, but enough that you can try to characterize. And then, maybe you see that you were doing something with a mobile device and all of the older patients declined. And then you have an idea that maybe this wasn't quite what you wanted to do. But that's probably the best you can do to try to understand what the selection bias might be.
Right, great. Well, Michelle, there's a couple more questions. I will capture them and send them to you. And between us, we probably can handle getting an answer back to folks.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for this fabulous overview. Thank you very much. If we all could applaud, you would be hearing lots of applause. There we go. And then I just want to say to the group, again, this is part of a series. This will be webinar number 1, although we decided just to do them in whatever order the speakers are available. Genetic Alliance itself runs a platform that incorporates everything we possibly can, because we've been grown up in the community by the community, and the URL is on the screen right now. So again, Michelle, thank you so much. Great to see you. And I'll be back to you with these last few questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for joining us. This will be posted on Genetic Alliance's website with the slides so that you can watch it there. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.